Since December 2024, after President Cyril Ramaphosa took over the G20 Presidency from Brazil, South Africa has convened over 130 meetings across the country, embarked on multiple visits to various African countries and those in other regions of the world. From the World Economic Forum in Switzerland to the United Nations in New York, the clarion call has gone out: solidarity, equality, and sustainability. But have these efforts borne any fruit? And how can momentum be sustained into the next, rather uncertain chapter of the G20 presidency of the United States of America? Good evening and welcome to this episode of G20 Focus. I'm Thulasizwe Semelane. We are just 6 days away from South Africa hosting the first G20 Leaders Summit on African soil, and the build-up has reached fever pitch with many moving parts to ensure that all systems are go. So the imminent conclusion of South Africa's presidency breaks a streak of 4 countries of the global south who have presided over the G20 over the past 4 years. First, it was Indonesia in 2022, which focused on achieving inclusive global recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. Then it was India in 2023, which focused on climate action, inclusive growth, and global cooperation on developmental issues. And then it was followed by Brazil in 2024, which advocated for social inclusion, global reform, and controversially called for taxing the ultra-rich to end hunger and poverty. Now it's South Africa's turn to see whether it's ready to host leaders of the world's largest economies and influence the final G20 Leaders Declaration by the beginning of next week. So tonight we ask the question: will South Africa's G20 presidency deliver for Africa and the global south? Joining us for this discussion are Elizabeth Sideropoulos, who is the Chief Executive of the South African Institute of International Affairs, also here in her capacity as the co-chair of the Think 20 Africa Standing Group, that is the T20 it is called, as well as Kamal Rambarut, who is from the Institute for Economic Justice. But first, before we delve into the issues that Africa and the global south have had to contend with in order to influence the G20 agenda are actually not simple. Let's watch this insert from SABC News US correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease setting the scene for us.
While South Africa's bilateral relationship with the United States has taken a severe knock since President Donald Trump's return to the White House in January, Washington's lack of engagement at the highest levels of Pretoria's G20 presidency has also been notable.
South Africa shouldn't even be in the G's anymore, because what's happened there is bad. I'm not going. I told them I'm not going. I'm not going to represent our country there. It shouldn't be there.
Secretary of State Marco Rubio on X in February criticized South Africa for using the G20 to promote solidarity, equality and sustainability, while the U.S. Treasury Secretary gave a preview of America's leadership of the group.
The U.S. is back on the international stage as a leader. We have whittled down the G20 back to basics. We are making it work for the American people better than ever. We have the G20 had become basically the G100 this past year. So it will be a concentrated group in Miami, seeing the best America has to offer with American leadership, thanks to President Trump.
Excellencies,
or the State Department official at the South Africa-hosted G20 foreign ministers meeting on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly this September.
Instead of elevating urgent global economic matters through a consensus-based approach, the G20 has become entangled in debates over every political wedge issue of the day, whether on gender-responsive budgeting, nation building, or pandemic surveillance. Let me be clear. Expanding the G20's scope in this way does not strengthen the forum. It dilutes it and undermines our ability to deliver on our most basic responsibilities.
U.S. positions we put to this economist who warned of the detrimental impacts of Washington's position on the bloc.
It will be diminished in the G20. But I think we have to remember the G20 is just one of many groupings. And G20 can be useful if it is a forum to project wider interests and to generate cooperation across countries. I think G20 is not useful if it does not do that, if it's just an expression of power among some of the larger countries. G7 was basically that, which is why it stopped being useful a very long time ago. G20, the real use of it, the dramatic, shall we say, expression of its usefulness happened really after the global financial crisis, when there was a coordinated effort. Since then, we haven't seen that much. I think the presidencies of the developing countries really did seek to bring that agenda forward by adding many more things that are of importance to the global majority.
The US presidency follows that of 4 countries from the global south: Indonesia, India, Brazil and South Africa, where development concepts aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals have been a central peg.
What does this mean for the G20 next year? That we have to think of it as possibly, one of those years that you have to blank out, that you have to go imagining that it didn't happen. It does not mean that initiatives brought in this year and also by the Brazilian and South African presidencies over the past couple of years will disappear, because you have other countries, most of the other G20 countries and coalitions of other countries willing to take that agenda forward. So increasingly, the world has learned, if you like, to swim around the big fish. And I think that's going to happen also with a lot of the initiatives that are seen as part of G20, but are often go beyond G20 or just are a subset of some G20 countries.
Professor Ghosh warned of broader G20 relevance for the bloc to abandon issues relevant to most of humanity.
The more G20 seeks to, as you say, whittle down, pare down, focus, concentrate on the issues that are of interest to large capital based in the north, the more irrelevant it will become for both the global economy and for global geopolitics. So, yes, they are free to do that. And G20 presidents have significant power in determining the agenda and the outcomes of the process during that year. But doing that actually has consequences. And those consequences would be much less relevance in the world.
President Trump will host next year's Leaders Summit at his Doral Golf Club near Miami. What's clear is that once the leadership mantle shifts to Washington, there will be a new sheriff in town. And a shift to what the US calls a return to basics, a recentering of the G20 to what the United States views as its core economic mission, and not to engage in what it describes as out-of-touch social initiatives disconnected from growth and stability. A return to the G20's founding mandate, which Professor Ghosh warns could lead to the bloc's growing irrelevance. Sherwin Bryce-Pease, SABC News, New York.
Sherwin, thank you for that. Sherwin Bryce-Pease, of course, is part of the formidable news infrastructure that we are deploying as the host broadcaster of the G20 as the Leaders Summit comes close. We're about to get into the Leaders Summit. Let's get into the discussion this evening. Elizabeth Sideropoulos as well as Kamal Rambarut. Quick reactions as your opening thoughts. That was the scene setter from our Sherwin Bryce-Pease, and central to it is this whole story about whether or not the mandate and focus of the G20 has been impermissibly and perhaps overly expanded from what it used to be, just focusing on what is now the finance track, which is one of many tracks. Just your first take, Elizabeth.
So the reason the agenda has expanded is because the issues that are critical, that are global challenges, have changed. When the G20 was first established as a finance ministers meeting in 1999 after the Asian financial crisis, it was intended to deal with that. In 2008, the realization dawned on the US and others that, in fact, the G7, which was at a leaders' summit, was not sufficient to actually be able to cope with the global financial crisis of 2008, and that they actually needed to bring in emerging economies into the conversation. And so, in fact, in 2008, 2009, the G20 was, at a leaders' level, able to, I think, successfully deal with the global financial crisis. And as a parenthesis, I think the G20 works really well, most times works really well at a crisis. It didn't do as well in the pandemic, but nevertheless. Over time, though, we know that when we're talking about finance issues, you can't but reflect on some of the broader global challenges that are facing us. Most notably, perhaps, and I know that this is not going to be something that's going to feature next year, is the issue of climate change, of disaster, sustainability, sustainable development goals, poverty, issues of debt, which are not just finance issues. And so the agenda has expanded. It has not expanded unilaterally. I think that's important to note, because this is a consensus-based organization, grouping, and it's responded, it has expanded in response to what leaders fundamentally regard as important. And the last 4 G20 presidencies, which, as you said at the beginning, are Global South presidencies, sought to highlight the centrality of development. When you talk about finance and you look at it through a very, very narrow prism, without really articulating it as an instrument of development, not that development is subservient to it, then you're adopting a very reductionist.
So this is Kamal. Just come in on this one. Are we able to take a step back and not be, I don't know, I'm playing devil's advocate, not be sentimental about it as people who are from the global south and would naturally champion some of these? I mean, I was looking at Brazil's presidency. That's when there's 15 various, tracks came into play, and South Africa has sustained, and it's sort of treading along the same tracks, similar tracks. Are we not being overly sentimental and perhaps not wanting to take a step back and listen to the critique that says, hang on, we've moved so far from what this formation was all about in the beginning, which was about issues of global finance and stabilizing the international economy?
Thanks to Lasizwe. It's great to be here with you again. Great to be here with Elizabeth. And your viewers at home, of course. I think just to add on to Elizabeth's point, financial stability in developing countries requires structural transformation, right? It requires sovereignty on many levels, including food sovereignty and having the ability to produce your own food. It requires the ability to industrialize so that you're not reliant on simply commodity exports. Because what happens when there's global shifts or global shocks is that those are the issues around food security, around industrial production. Those then undermine the financial systems of those countries because those shocks can be so harsh. And so to separate financial stability from structural transformation is a mistake. And it's one that I don't that the agenda of South Africa's G20 made, which is why industrialization is a big theme. For the first time, industrial policy is being discussed in a serious way in the G20. This is historic. 10 years ago, 20 years ago, to speak about industrial policy would have been a complete swear word. No one would have taken you seriously. But South Africa has put that on the agenda to say this is something necessary for inclusive growth, for financial stability in the long run. And similarly, with the Food Security Task Force, South Africa made a task force specifically to look at how does international finance create excessive volatility in food prices that makes it expensive for the ordinary person to buy food, and how does that escalate levels of hunger. And so, in international relations, you have to have a stance that's based on your values, or you have to have a stance that's based on your. So to expect global South countries not to put forward their interest for structural transformation would be disingenuous. Of course, global South countries have to put that agenda forward.
I must say, Elizabeth, that when I heard that the theme of the South African presidency of the G20 was, and I have to put controversial, I was puzzled a bit. Solidarity, equality, sustainability. Why was it controversial? And is it controversial beyond the United States? So other countries that are not necessarily global South countries? What's their attitude towards it?
So yes, you would have thought it would be fairly sort of everybody could probably agree on such really great words that are about international cooperation, looking out for each other and so on. But I mean, I think it's a reflection of the domestic developments in the United States, which, as we know, earlier this year, basically said Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals are not for them. They have forsaken, so to speak, the belief in climate change, certainly the administration. And it's about make Africa make America great again, make Africa great again, make America great again, and that the world has been living off America's generosity. So that reflection then translates into a position that says, well, solidarity, equality, sustainability is not in America's interests. What is interesting is that I think there are a couple of countries that have taken a similar position. They're not necessarily countries of the global north.
Yeah.
But this is a reflection, I think, of a broader trend that we're seeing around the world, where you see the rise of populist figures, because I think this is a reaction in some part to the fact that economies haven't worked for many people in these countries, whether in the global north or the global south. And I mean, if we look at the inequality report from the panel that was chaired by Joe Stiglitz and was released very recently, I mean, one of these issues around inequality, which is, I think, at the heart of many of our problems, and actually speaks directly to what Kamal said about the interconnectedness between financial stability and the need to actually develop so that you narrow inequality. But countries where there is high inequality also, democratic countries where there is high inequality also face democratic backsliding because of the concern that they believe that democracies are not delivering. And so this is part of that broader movement that we're seeing, and we've been seeing for a few years. This is not just a phenomenon in the US, and it's not just a phenomenon of the last 11 months.
So I will ask you what you did, what you've been doing as part of the T20. I'll almost ask you to account to all of us this evening. But Kamal, solidarity, equality, sustainability rolls off the tongue. But what is your assessment as we come to, the business end of South Africa's presidency of the G20? Over 130 meetings, various tracks, I count about 15, various task forces and working groups. What in essence could South Africa have done, or has South Africa done in the last 12 months or so to advance that?
Sure, Thulasizwe, it's a really important question, and the answer is often somewhat counterintuitive, because really, as the chair, you have kind of a few main responsibilities, but there's certain things you can't do as the chair. You can't really negotiate in the meetings themselves, right? Because you have to be the kind of the one managing the room, the one bringing everyone together, and so you can't have aggressive positions on issues. You have to navigate various interests, often conflicting interests, and so it makes you the weakest negotiator really in the room as the chair. But your power is setting the agenda, and I think that this was a real success of the South African government, setting an agenda with progressive values and values that are reflected in our constitution as well. As are sustainability, equality, and solidarity. So that's the first kind of success. And that was a success that was achieved in December last year, right? The second kind of achievement that you can speak of is all the things you spoke about, Thulasizwe. It's the declarations, it's the non-binding principles, it's the research reports, it's the ability to elevate the issues and set an agenda, right? And on that score, I think on various issues, there have been successes there. The third kind of thing that I think you can look at about whether it was a success or not is how well you can actually keep this group together and not allow it to disrupt. There have been many attempts to kind of destroy the forum. You see the USA trying to pull out, to actively try to disrupt, and you see proxies kind of trying to do the same thing. So actually keeping everyone together in a moment in which multilateralism itself seems to be collapsing, and in a moment where you have a number of G20 countries who are all sitting in the room, many of which are at conflict with each other, hot wars, trade wars, etc., and keeping this together can be seen as a diplomatic win. And I think that the last thing I would add to how we can measure success as well as a country is how we're able to take the issues that we've put onto the G20 agenda and how do we reintegrate them into our national policies. So, for example, care was a huge area of concern in the Women's Empowerment Working Group. Can South Africa integrate a national care policy, for example?
All right.
Food security, buffer stocks. Can we do that nationally as well?
All right.
So it's our ability.
Let me pause you there for a moment. I do need to take a quick break. So nice scene setter there. When we come back, we've framed the question about whether South Africa's presidency can deliver for Africa and the global south. But what is the agenda for Africa and the global south? We go in that direction up next. Welcome back. This is G20 Focus on SABC News as well as live on SABC 2 and SABC Plus. We are the host broadcaster of the G20, the Leaders Summit coming up in the next few days. And the question we are asking tonight, will South Africa's G20 presidency deliver for Africa and the global south? But what is the agenda for Africa and the global south? And is it appropriate to separate that and say for Africa and the global south? Or is it, something that is almost common, that the agenda is common among all of these countries with their various priorities and challenges? Take the issue of infrastructure as an example. On the African continent, we know that it's one of the main priorities, infrastructure development. Let's show you now those countries that have advanced infrastructure as far as the African Development Bank is concerned. That is the index from last year. Countries that are leading in terms of infrastructure development being Seychelles, Egypt, and I think you see Libya, Mauritius, as well as South Africa there. But the flip side of that picture, of course, is the number of countries that are grappling with basic infrastructure. And in that regard, you will find a number of African countries such as South Sudan, one of the world's newest countries. They also tend to feature in that regard. So let's pick up the conversation then. Elizabeth Sideropoulos and Kamal Ramburut continue to join me. Elizabeth, let me pick up with you then. When we say, will South Africa's presidency of the G20 deliver for Africa and the global south? What is the agenda of these countries, and is it common?
I think it's important to recognize that across the global south, across the developing world, there are common challenges. The degree to which these various challenges are important to different countries or different regions, of course, varies. But it doesn't mean that they are so vastly different. So absolutely, if you're talking about infrastructure, some countries have greater challenges than others. If you take the African continent specifically, we know that it's not just about thinking about infrastructure in a national way, that at the end of the day, if we're wanting to see the achievement of an African continental free trade area, the building of regional value chains, etc., we need to be focused on building really regional infrastructure. So that's just to give you one example. If you look at the South African agenda for this year, to sort of three areas come to mind specifically, and we've, I think, touched on them a little earlier. The first, one of the key priorities that South Africa put on the agenda was, of course, the issue of debt. Now, for African countries, and particularly low-income countries, that's absolutely crucial. On the flip side of debt, of course, is the big challenge that most African countries face, which is the African risk premium. And so there, the idea behind a cost of capital commission, we didn't have a cost of capital commission, but I think what's significant...
In fact, as you say that, I believe we do have a graphic representation of that debt situation for the African continent.
Exactly. So that's important. And even if we are not able to achieve something very, very concrete at the end of this month, the fact that this has now really become a very debated, hot topic on the global scene, I think is important, because it's sowing the seeds of things that we can pick up next year and the year after. Because it's not just through the G20 presidency that you can do things. The second point relates to critical minerals and industrialization. Yes. The fact that Africa is endowed with many critical minerals, both for the green transition, but also more broadly. And we need to be able to use those in a way that help us to develop, rather than in the extractive way that minerals have driven Africa's dependence on external actors. And that's been a priority of South Africa. It's a priority of Africa. The other one is, of course, just energy transitions and the climate finance debate, adaptation, not just mitigation. For Africa, we have to be able to raise funds to create much more resilient societies to deal with climate change. These are not societies that generate a lot of emissions. And so a lot of these issues are critical to the continent. The AU is sitting at the table. This is the second year that they're sitting at the table. I think the challenge is really to broaden the debate across member states in Africa as well. And that is something that is happening. And I think the fact that South African presidency also held 3 meetings outside of South Africa on issues that were critical. Food security, I think, in Cairo. Debt in Addis a couple of weeks ago or last week, and the third one in Nigeria, which I cannot remember, but Kamal might remember.
He's ready. He's on standby.
He's ready.
He's got it covered.
These are, and the last thing I want to say is that relating to multilateral development banks and them being able to sweat their balance sheets. This has been on the agenda for some years now, and it's really built up, particularly since the Italian presidency. So it's also important to see all of these presidencies as a process, and that each presidency builds on the other. And that's also been there's been some progress there.
Kamal, as far as these issues go, these are not just theoretical for the global south, developing nations, many of them island nations, by the way, in terms of the issues of sustainability. That comes to the fore. They are not theoretical, they are lived experiences, aren't they?
Yes, exactly. They are lived experiences. And let's take, for example, one of the reasons why South Africans are so frustrated with the G20. Joe Burgers in particular. Joe Burgers are saying, guys, we've had issues with roads, potholes, with these things all along, and now the G20 comes and we've got infrastructure. It shows how important infrastructure is, right? And one of the biggest issues that a lot of global South countries have around financing infrastructure is, as I say, it's the development finance that goes into that. You need to have be able to contract the debt and be able to invest into that infrastructure, right? And part of what the multilateral discussion is about, as Elizabeth just mentioned, is it's about financing the infrastructure for a just transition. It's about financing the exploration for critical minerals. It's about financing the infrastructure to connect our roads between African countries and the railroads, right? So financing is really important. And one of the things that the G20 does is that it makes recommendations or it makes commitments to things it'll do in existing multilateral bodies like multilateral development banks, right? Because the G20 is not an implementing agent. There's no secretariat. There's no one who can say, I work for the G20. Everyone works for their own countries. Countries come and they talk, right? But that conversation can lead to those countries saying, we really need to upscale financing for MDBs. So those MDBs, those multilateral development banks, can invest then into the infrastructure so that we can get infrastructure, not just when it's the G20, but we can get infrastructure consistently throughout the year in, year out, right?
Yeah.
And this is one key area that I think the G20 really needs to step up on, and it's meeting commitments to accelerate the financing to multilateral development banks. It hasn't been enough financing to meet the agenda of tripling the multilateral development banks lending, to tripling renewable energy, for example.
Yeah.
So this is a key area, upscaling multilateral development banks that the
Kamal,
has to achieve.
I think you're onto a very important point, and if you don't mind, I want to come back and start with you, picking up on meeting that commitment of financing for multilateral development banks, such that there's delivery on all the other issues. I want to do that immediately after the break, and of course, Elizabeth will also take us through. Now that we've established what the agenda is for the African continent, for the developing nations and the global south, what is the actual work then that has gone towards ensuring that that is advanced during South Africa's presidency? That and more coming up in a moment. Welcome back. This is G20 Focus. We continue our conversation on South Africa's presidency and the priorities of Africa and the global south. So, Elizabeth, in fact, I wanted to, apologies for that. Kamal, you were making a point before we went to the break, and I made the undertaking that we'll pick up on that point, the G20 following through on the commitments around multilateral development banks, such that all of these nice things we're talking about, the cost of financing, the infrastructure development and resilience, climate resilience and response are then possible through those multilateral development banks. Complete that point for me, please. You're saying that's the one area that you'd like the G20 putting pedal to metal as far as that is concerned.
Exactly. No, I think the point was made to just emphasize that this is one key area of development that the G20 countries really make the biggest contribution to. They are the biggest contributors to the World Bank. They're the biggest contributors to other multilateral development banks like the African Development Bank, the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank, and of course the BRICS or New Development Bank. And I think one of the things that one of the things we're finding in this G20 process is that there are also competing interests, oftentimes between many of these countries. And one of the things that I think a lot of developing countries are finding in these spaces is that some of the solutions around, for example, critical mineral beneficiation, for example, regional food buffer stocks, or a regional trade integration amongst global south countries, that might not come from these large multilateral institutions, and it might need to come from south-south cooperation, like the New Development Bank and like regional development banks financing.
Yeah. All right, Elizabeth, then let me come back to you. Your area, I don't even know how to refer to it. It's called T20, and that's short for Think 20. It's a fascinating name. And I read somewhere that now as we get closer to the summit, you guys are going to take a step back now. A lot of the work has been done by yourselves.
Yes.
What work has been done to advance all of these issues?
It was completed on Friday, and it's like, phew, thanks. So the Think 20 is one of the engagement groups of the G20. And the engagement groups are usually sort of non-state groups, so not part of the official G20 government track, that in some cases represents specific interests. So, for example, you have the B20, the Business 20, the summit, they're holding their summit next week. The Labour 20, the Civil 20, the Youth 20, the Urban 20. I think there are about 12 or 13 engagement groups. The Think 20 is the engagement group for think tanks and also universities. And what we have done over the course of this year as chairs of the T20 is to convene think tank members from around the world, not just not just G20 countries. We've built up a community over many years. This was established in 2012 to focus on particular issues related to the South African agenda. We've had 5 task forces looking at trade and investment, WTO and reform of the WTO being an important dimension there, as well as supply chains, ensuring supply chains are working, etc., etc. Issue of industrialization. Looked at digital transformation and digital public infrastructure as an important dimension, as well as artificial intelligence. We've looked at the need to reform of the international financial institutions or the architecture as part of the broader challenge of how do we finance our significant developmental needs across the world. We've looked at accelerating the Sustainable Development Goals, and here specifically one of the areas of focus was food security, but also social protection, care economies. And then lastly, of course, on climate and just energy transitions, where we also looked at the issue of critical minerals. All of these brilliant minds from around the world produced policy briefings. There was a communique, a high-level communique was submitted to the Sherpas in June at the 3rd meeting of the Sherpas. And at the end, last week, literally, we handed in the more comprehensive document to the Department of International Relations and Cooperation. And we've obviously also engaged with the different working groups of the official track, bringing together some of the great minds.
But then I will come back to you, Elizabeth, immediately after the break, because that's a great answer. But it's one for the policy geeks. Eh?
Yes.
So when I come back after the break, I'd like us to talk about specifically along the track of what the G20 has done in the past in times of crises. What has been achieved? So, the various declarations in those areas. And I think we can pick up on that conversation from that point. You're watching G20 Focus. Stay with us. We have more for you in just a moment. Welcome back. You're watching G20 Focus. So it can all get quite confusing, a lot of moving parts. There's this concept within the G20, they call it the Sherpa track, right? And that whole idea of a Sherpa comes from Nepal. These are the people in the Himalayas who help people who are seeking to summit mountains such as Mount Everest. And so the whole idea is that the Sherpa track are the people who are assisting this whole process, Elizabeth, with moving forward and rolling it up the hill and helping it steadily. So we were talking a short while ago about the work that you did as T20, but it's one of 15 tracks that are being tracked by the Sherpa with 15 working groups on the Sherpa track. What has been achieved?
So there are 15 working groups in the Sherpa track. They're part of the official government track. And then there are the engagements. So the Think 20, the Labour 20, the B20 are not part of the official Sherpa track, although the submissions of all the work they have done has been submitted to the Sherpa track. So the idea behind it is really I think it's part of the way in which the G20 is also much more inclusive, because it brings in different actors. It's not just governments talking to each other. And it is ideally about these different constituencies making input into what goes into the Leaders Declaration. Of course, in reality, things are not as simple as that. Clearly, you can have some brilliant, from a research perspective, some brilliant evidence-informed proposals, recommendations that you believe the G20 should adopt. But there is a process. Firstly, it also depends on where your own government is sitting on some of these issues. And then it depends on where other governments are sitting on these issues. And it is because this is a consensus organization or grouping, you have to there are trade-offs. And so it's not just about having the great ideas based on evidence from a think tank perspective or a particular perspective, say, from the business or the labor community. It's also then being able to take those ideas and seeing how you can champion them within the official track. And it's also the case that, we're all producing volumes and volumes of paper, and we know that, it's impossible to read them and to take them all in. And it's also important that, what is happening at the moment with the negotiations around the Leaders Declaration have had a whole process starting from sort of earlier in the year. And so if you've got some really good ideas, it doesn't help to get them to them now.
Yeah.
You need to get them into the policy discussions, into the policy processes much earlier. But as I say, it's not as easy as it sounds. And even if something gets into the declaration from all the working groups, including the official ones,
yes.
The issue, as Kamal pointed out, is also the challenge around implementation. These are political declarations. They're expected to show political will of these 21 members of the G20. But then, the responsibility on driving these, whether it is, supporting a particular initiative in the IMF or the World Bank, or doing something regionally because they've committed to it, depends on the individual countries.
Yeah.
There's no necessarily accountability or enforcement mechanism.
Yeah. Sounds a bit to me, Kamal, like to allude to perhaps a concept in the South African governance scheme of things. Sounds like a green paper where, you are consulting as widely as possible and just a field of ideas and policy options such that you then have access to it. Do I have it covered correctly? But on a serious note, how much does that process help in sort of narrowing down differences towards the Leaders Declaration at the end?
Sure. Thanks, Thulasizwe. I think you should compare it more to an embizo that's held by the GNU when it is paper, right? Because whether those parties go back to their various ministries and implement or not is another story, right? So that's how I describe it more in our own context. But I think that the G20 has made some very influential decisions, right? And if you look at the last kind of since if you look at 2021, there was a decision to increase special drawing rights allocations to $650 billion US, right? That's a huge liquidity boost that was given by the IMF to all of its members, right? And the decision to do that was made in the G20, right? The G20 was the fourth that decision was decided. Again, the debt service suspension initiative, which we've discussed in a previous show, that happened between 2020 and 2021, it suspended $12.9 billion US worth of debt for 48 countries. That decision was made in the G20, right? And G20 countries have also done other things around trade, for example. There was something that happened in 2008 that was kind of reaffirmed annually, which is this idea of a no protectionism pledge, where G20 members can pledge not to.
I apologize. Just when you get into your cadence, I do need to take a quick break. I will pick up with you in just a moment. After the break, we draw towards a close of our discussion, and I'll get the concluding thoughts of my guests this evening. Welcome back to G20 Focus. Let's get the concluding thoughts of my two guests this evening. Very quickly to the both of you. Elizabeth, if you were to be asked what will be the legacy of South Africa's G20 presidency, has that been shaped or is it still in the process of being shaped, and what will it look like in your view?
I think a lot has to do with whether we'll get a Leaders Declaration. I think we will. But perhaps just to point on two things. There are a few others, but I'll also let Kamal come in. And for me, two, I think, really important points were what was achieved in the Development Working Group. One was actually getting a call to action on illicit financial flows. This has been something that South Africa has put on the agenda 10 years ago. And we finally got something that actually all members signed off on. And we also, I think, had an input, and it's in the Financing for Development Compromiso de Sevilla document that came out in July about illicit financial flows. These are critical to help with domestic resource mobilization and part of the broader resource constraints that African countries are facing, how you deal with. That's the one. And the other one, which didn't lead to a statement, a consensual statement, but which nevertheless is about putting things on the agenda and pushing these things forward, again in the Development Working Group, is around global public goods. A contentious term among some countries, but it is about how we deal with global challenges. That's the other word that is used, but that these are global public goods that we all benefit from. and that we actually need to look after and that we need to resource.
Is this more around the environment and?
It's around the environment. It's also health. It's pandemics.
Okay.
It's a number of issues that can fall into the category of global public goods. Very contentious, but South Africa put that on the agenda. There was very vibrant debate over several months, and we have a chair statement, which I think then is part of the documentation that drives forward agendas in the future.
So perhaps we don't have agreement now, and who knows what happens 4 or 5 G20 presidencies down the line, and then we'll look back and say 2025. Kamal, lastly, the last word to you, shaping the legacy of South Africa's G20 presidency.
I think a declaration would, of course, be nice. The Johannesburg Declaration must be nice. But I also think that having something tangible around the 4 priorities would be incredibly important. Around critical minerals, a critical minerals framework for the G20 would be a huge kind of success, especially if that has, progressive things in it around beneficiation at source and value addition in developing countries. And then when it comes to debt, I think that if the South African government is able to advance the issue of a borrowers club in the G20 space, or even outside of the G20 space, using the moment to advance the borrowers club, that would be a huge win. And then, of course, the question and the theme of this has been South-South cooperation. What can the G20 deliver for the global South? And I think the one way that the G20 definitely can is if all of the BRICS plus countries, if all of the global South countries sitting in the G20 are able to identify the wins that they can only make through South-South cooperation and take that forward with energy. I think that would be a huge win.
Right.
Thank you.
All right, thank you for that. I've got to thank both of you for having joined me. I think this show in particular has gone quite a great deal of the distance in answering that question. What does the G20 do? I do believe that in the last while in the conversations, a lot of that has been answered to a great extent. That's it in terms of the build-up. But do join us next week as we discuss the Leaders Declaration that we hope will have taken shape to a great extent, if not concluded already. And that will be at the conclusion of the G20 Leaders Summit. See you there.